Hello. In the last video here in our Scratch project, we got our rock so that they could be hit by the rocket and break up into smaller pieces. So now we want to get an explosion going for when that happens. So yeah, we'll just get started on that without too much pre-explanations. So we'll just create a new sprite. We'll call it Explosion. Explosion. Zoom in on that. So I'm going to draw as a line. So we'll get the line tool and we'll just use black with a 1 width. So when we draw with the line tool, I'm going to make what I would call a comic book kablam shape. When we're drawing with the line tool, if we notice, if we start on the end of a line, a blue circle will appear. And if we click inside of that blue circle, what we're making will be continuous. So this is a continuous line. And by doing that, we can create a continuous shape. So we'll just make sure we're grabbing those blue circles to start each of our new lines, and that will make a one shape. So we'll go something like this. So this is more or less what I would describe it as being a comic book kablam shape. So it's kind of like a star. We'll just do a couple more. And then we'll even it out a little bit. So that will get us one shape. And as one shape, we'll be able to take it. We can select this and fill it in. Once it's filled in, we can get rid of the outline. So now it's just this shape. So with it filled in, it's easier to change it around a bit. So we'll just change this around a little bit and try to get the center points kind of evenish, but not be too even. We don't want it an overly even shape. So maybe something along these lines. And that's a little bit overly even. So it could probably use a little bit of varying. I'm not greatly artistic, so I just settle for what I can do. So we're going to call that good enough and not spend a lot of time drawing perfect shapes because I'm not very good at it. So we'll put this into a gradient and let's get this a yellow-orange kind of gradient. So maybe something like that kind of deal. And if we take the whole shape, we can duplicate it. So we'll make a copy of it. Let's center it first. So we'll make a copy. We'll paste the copy. We'll center it. Then we'll grab the handle and then press the Alt key. So we want to click on the handle, press the Alt key, and that will cause it to expand from the center. So we'll expand that a bit and we'll push it backward until it's behind the other one. So now there should be, the other one should be on top. We can take that backside one and change its colors now. So we might want to invert them or not. So it's barely showing because the size difference is really quite small. So we might want to increase the size difference a little bit too. So we're going to make that one reddy orange. So a darker color. And let's try expanding it a little bit more. first. So we'll click it, press the Alt key, and expand it out a little bit more. And we can see we get that really nice outline around it. That it also has a gradient. And then we might want to just more manually pull it around. Now, yeah, that was strange. A little bit of strange behavior sometimes with the online version. Now to move these around, we might want to use the arrow keys. Just to get them a little bit bigger. And to just sort of expand that outline a little bit. So maybe around there, and maybe up and over one there. And maybe move this one a little bit. And this one a little bit. So maybe like that. So that gets us what I would call a comic book kablam. Now we can select the whole thing and shrink it down some, because that's pretty big for our explosion. So we'll shrink it down, maybe a little bit more. Now for animating the explosion, there's lots of things to play around with, and we'll just sort of discuss that, and then I'm going to make a relatively simple animation for it. So we're going to animate it in code, but we'll use the picture to kind of describe what we can do. So I'm going to grab the handle with the Alt key so it keeps it center. So there's different ways an explosion can work. An explosion can get big really fast and then shrink. That would be the most accurate kind of explosion. So if I was going to do something like that, I might want to change its brightness. So it starts off bright, starts off small, goes boom, and then kind of shrinks in, with the brightness being manipulated back into colorfulness, because the brightness would change how colorful it is. So yeah, this is really twitching around today. This is an online version thing. Sometimes it acts pretty twitchy like this, and I have no idea why it's doing that. I have no clue as to how to get that to stop. So let's just peek at that in big screen. Yeah, it's doing weird stuff here today. So that looks pretty good in big screen. So let's go over into code and some of the things we're going to want to do with our explosion. So yeah, if I was going to do the big explosion, I would probably start by changing brightness. So I would probably increase brightness so that it started off bright and then came back towards this color. So it would start with a big increase and then decrease. So doing that, I would use something like 2 repeat loops. So I would have a repeat loop that makes it quickly get larger, and then a repeat loop that brings it back into size and color. But I'm just going to use 1 repeat loop and do a more simple thing. So one of the first things I would look at is ghost, and I would put the ghost to around 50. So that will change its transparency and make it, whoops, that was a mistake. Let's get set ghost effect to 0, and then click this once. So that's how that would get together. We would start with events, when clicked, hide. So we'll want it to hide. We'll want to set the size of it. So I want it to start at very small. So if we go into size here, we can find its minimum size. We just type a 1 in, So its minimum size it's going to be allowed is 5, so it's going to start like this, a tiny little point. So we'll set it to its minimum size of 5. We'll set the ghost effect to make sure we're in a stable place so that it starts at 0 and then gets changed by 50, so it has 50% ghost effect. Let's see, is there anything else we need to do here? No, because we're going to keep the animation simple. So if we were going to do more than one stage to the explosion, so where it got bigger and then shrank in, we might want to put in brightness and then have it get bigger at a really bright, and then when it gets to its biggest size, then have the brightness return to normal so it gets its color back. But from here, I'm just going to go with the simple one-stage explosion because it's easier. So we'll use a forever loop, and we'll need an if statement. So when rockets are hitting rocks, a lot of rockets can hit the rocks at one time. So a rocket can be hitting a rock over here, over here, over here, over here, pretty much at the same time. So we need a way to store the locations, multiple locations, rather than one location at a time. And to do that, what we use is a list. So we're going to make a list called explosions and make it for all sprites. So explosions will be for all sprites. Now, what'll go into explosions is an X and a Y location. Now, I've experimented with populating the list from the rocket, and I find that doesn't work so good. So what we're going to do is we're going to populate that list from the position of the rock. So if it's touching a rocket, then we will put the location of the rock into the list, and that will be where the explosion will happen. It would be nicer if the explosion could happen from the rocket's position, but yeah, when I put it onto the rocket, I get very inconsistent results for the explosions happening, whereas if I put them onto the rocks, I get a pretty consistent result where just about every hit gets an explosion. So what goes into the list is the X position and the Y position. Now, because our explosion is actually supposed to be the rocket exploding, we don't need different size explosions. But if the explosion was the thing we're shooting explosions, we might also want to have a size. So we would add an X position, a Y position, and a size for the explosion, but we're not going to need explosion sizes because it's a rocket exploding, and they always explode with the same explosion unless they're hitting something explodable, which rocks are not particularly explodable, so we'll just have one size explosion. So over in explosions, we'll make the place where the list gets emptied. So what we'll do is we'll empty the list out to make sure it's always empty to start off. So we'll delete all of explosions. So that would be everything in this list. So now we need a way to populate the list. So let's see, we have an explosion that's going to happen where the rock is at when it's touching a rocket. So we want to add things to the explosion list. So we'll duplicate this. We accidentally have added things to the explosion list. We'll add X and we'll add Y of the rock. So that goes right up here if it's touching a rocket, it's going to give the rock's X and Y position. So the explosion's going to happen inside of the rock instead of at the rocket. But like I said, when I tried to put it onto the rocket, it was very inconsistent, and there was actually very few explosions happening. So that's all that we really need to add here to the rock. Everything else happens in explosions. Let's empty that list out just for the appearance. There we go. Now the list has nothing in it. So we need a loop to go, okay, it's time to make an explosion. So when something is inside of the list, its length will no longer equal 0. So when an item gets added, so if we add a thing to explosions, its length becomes 1. So that's the measurement that we use to decide it's time to make an explosion. Anytime there's one thing in that list, there'll be two things. So that's right here, it's length of explosions. So if the length of explosions is greater than 0, then the explosion should create a clone of itself. So we'll go create clone of myself. Then we'll need when I start as a clone. So this is what will happen when it starts as a clone. It should go to the X and Y position. So it will go to the position. The position comes from the list. So down at the list, we have item 1 of explosions and item 2 of explosions. So we'll duplicate that. We want to get item 1 and item 2. Then we want to delete item 1 2 times. Because when we delete an item, when we delete item 1, item 2 becomes item 1. So we're always going to be deleting item 1. We just do it 2 times to end up where we want to be. So now we have our explosion at the place in the list. We can make the explosion show and go into our repeat loop. Now 10 is a lot of repeats. So we're going to change 10 to 5, and that will increase the speed that the explosion happens at. So everything else for the animation in these 5 loops is going to happen just by changing the appearance. So we're going to want to change the size. Let's just experiment with 10 and see what it does. Then we'll want to change the color effect. So we'll change the color effect ghost. So we'll change the ghost effect. So we're at 5. It starts at 50, and if we want it to disappear all the way by the end of the loops, we'll go change ghost effect by 10. So that will make the explosion disappear as this is happening. So it's just going to get bigger and disappear. And then the other effect we can change is, let's see, change effect. So we can change Pixelate effect. So that will kind of break the shape up and make it do what's called pixelating. So we can add that in as well and see how that works. So we'll leave the list on for the first try and see if things are working here. So that's getting us a little bit of explosion. The pixelating is working pretty good too. It's breaking out the explosion a bit. We can see things flashing into the list. So that's about it. That's about all we need to see of the list. So let's just hide that, because it's a pretty big obstacle on the thing. Now, we might want to look at maybe 50 was too much for ghost effect, because the explosion was not very easy to see. Now we can see a problem here. Our explosions are not disappearing, so that's because we forgot to do something. After all of this stuff happens, we should be deleting the clone. Let's try this more around 30. Now, ghost effect 5. If we wanted it to disappear all of the way, we would use a calculator. So let's get a calculator. So we're starting at 30. So I wonder, what is 70 divided by 5? Is 14. So let's try changing ghost effect by 14 instead of 10. And we'll see how that looks. So that gets a little bit more visual to the explosions, but they're not too much. So I think that's reasonably successful. The explosions are happening pretty reliably. Just about everything we hit gets an explosion. Yeah, I think that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll come back and we'll try to figure out how to get the random UFO that flies past in the actual Asteroids game, where it has a UFO that comes through and shoots randomly. We'll try to do something like that. And until then, I hope that this video was helpful. And until the next one, take care.